Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is February 13th, 2018, and my guest is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. His latest book is Skin in the Game, Hidden Asymmetries in Everyday Life. This is his 8th EconTalk episode. Nassim, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me again.
And I'm both excited and slightly embarrassed to say that our topic for today is Skin in the Game. It's in a way our third episode on the topic. We did one episode on the paper you wrote with Konstantin Sandis that had the title, The Skin in the Game Heuristic for Protection Against Tail Events. Then last August of 2017, we did have an EconTalk episode on the book that you're having that's coming out shortly.
You mean on some aspects of the book?
Some aspects of the book when it was in draft form. And today we're going to talk about a number of topics from the book that we didn't get to.
Which, in fact, are central.
Which are, in fact, central. I mean, I don't know how we had that other episode, but we managed it somehow. And I'm sure we're going to get into some other things as well. But our topics for today are rationality, broadly defined, decision-making under uncertainty, and I think we're going to get to religion as well.
And the notion of survival.
And the notion of survival, which is actually, the more I think about it, the more I read your work, the more I think of it as being central to the lessons that you have to teach in terms of decision-making under uncertainty and skin in the game. So I want to start with two kinds of probability that you talk about. One is ensemble probability, and the second one is time probability. Set this up with an example from the casino that you use in the book.
So most people have the illusion that you can compute probabilities, what we call state space in finance, by looking, say, at returns of the market, what people are making, returns of businesses, and that it would apply to you. In fact, if you have the smallest probability of an absorbing barrier, then you're never going to be able to capture that market return or that ensemble return.
Explain what an absorbent barrier is first.
Yeah, it's an absorbent barrier is a point that you reach beyond which you can't continue. You stop. So, for example, if you die, that's an absorbent barrier. So, for example, most people don't realize that, as Warren Buffett keeps saying, he says, in order to make money, you must first survive. It's not like an option; it's a condition. So once you hit that point, you're done. You're finished. And that applies in the financial world, of course, to what we call ruin, financial ruin. But it can be any form of ruin. It can be ecological ruin. It could be personal ruin. It could be a death of a community, whatever it is. So let's isolate the point with the following thought experiment. You send 100 people to a casino, and the casino, you don't know the return from casino. It's just like set up by some weird person, and you don't know if the person who set it up is giving you the edge or not. Okay, so you send them each. You give each of the people, him or her, an allowance, and ask to gamble for an entire day. So. And then you would compute the return, the expected return of the casino per day, by what comes back. So, if person number 27 goes bust, okay, loses everything. Okay, will it affect number 28?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, so you can still. So you probably will have a certain number of people bust in your sample, but you don't mind. You count that as zero, and you compute the expected return, and you can figure out if it's a lunatic or a very smart person running the casino. You get the exact return per day of the casino for this gambling strategy. Now, if on the other hand you send this one person, say yourself, you go 100 days to the casino with the same strategy, and on day number 27, you are bust. Will there be a number 28?
There will not.
Exactly. So that's the absorbent barrier. So eventually, if you have an absorbent barrier, the question is not whether you're going to survive or not. The question is, when are you going to go bust? Because eventually you're going to go bust. So your return, your expected return, if you have a strategy that entails ruin, is exactly the expected return is, depending on how you count it, is you're going to lose everything. The expected return is, you can count it at negative infinity if you're using log, or negative 100%, whatever it is. So any strategy that has ruin will eventually have, if you extend time to infinity, will have a negative 100% return. And that's not very well understood, because a lot of people engage in strategies that entail ruin, not realizing that eventually it's going to catch up to them. But one thing I learned when I was a trader, the very first lesson from all traders was, listen, take all the risks you want, but make sure you're going to be here tomorrow. The game is about being in the office tomorrow at 7 a.m. because we start early. So that was a game. I mean, you take all the risk you want, and effectively every single surviving person, say take Ray Dalio, take Warren Buffett, all these people, all they worry about is ruin. They don't worry about all these complicated stuff. And in finance emerged two paradigms. One, Markowitz, which is entirely academic, not even used by Markowitz himself, which is like computing complicated probabilities of what may happen with returns and future returns, very complicated. And then the other one is a very simple one that focuses on two things: what you expect to make, adjusted every day, and survival. Make sure you don't go bust. So almost all traders who have survived use the latter, okay? And every single academic who went to trade, and we counted, I think, in 1998, how many academics went bust after the LTCM. Academics, you mean in finance, not in mathematics. And we noticed that it's close to 100%. There's only one person who may have survived in the 1998 collapse, when long-term capital management, which effectively was a short-term firm, went bust, making bets on small probabilities.
So let me try to restate this a little bit. I think in thinking about the casino, there's a presumption that the odds are in favor of the casino. You start out by saying we don't know how the casino owner is setting things up, but if you have a long-running casino like in Las Vegas today, the odds are slightly in favor of management. And so one way to say what you just said is you can't have a lifetime strategy of earning money by going to the casino, because
no, that's not what I'm saying. Actually, I'm saying is even stronger. I am saying that even if you have the edge in the presence of a probability of ruin, you will be ruined, even if you had the edge.
If you play long enough.
Unless you engage in strategies designed by traders and rediscovered by every single surviving trader, very similar to what we'd call something called the Kelly criterion, which is to play with the house money. In other words, you start betting in a casino. The strategy is as follows: you go with $100 or whatever you want, and you bet $1. If you lose, you bet less than $1. You bet, like, say, 90 cents or whatever. And if you make money, you start betting with the house money, and it's called, playing with a market money, or playing with the house money. And so you increase your bet as you're making money, and you reduce your bet as you're losing money. And that strategy is practically the only one that allows you to gamble or engage in risky strategies without ruin.
And it challenges another way to think about it is that there's an asymmetry there between wins and losses that one might think of as, but many people think of as irrational. But you're saying exactly. It's not irrational, and more than that, often we as economists make fun of people who say, well, I was way ahead and I took a big gamble because I wasn't using my own money. I was using the house money. And economists look at that and we laugh and we say, but it's your money. You could have walked away. You could have kept it. And you're saying that it's actually rational to treat the money you win differently from the money you lose.
Exactly. I mean, behavioral economists have something called mental accounting, which states exactly what you just said, that treating money according to the source is irrational, because these are the one-period models. That's how they view the world, as one-shot experiment. They don't view the world as repetition. A repetition of bets. So if you look at the world as repetition of bets on the condition of survival, then mental accounting is not only not irrational, but is necessary. Any other strategy would be effectively irrational.
So I'm going to read a long quote from the paper, which I think sums this up really well, and it's shockingly provocative, and especially when we think about what is going through people's heads when they're sitting in an experiment that we're trying to generalize from. This is what you say, quote, "The flaw in psychology papers is to believe that the subject doesn't take any other tail risks anywhere outside the experiment, and crucially will never take any risk at all. The idea in social science of loss aversion has not been thought through properly. It is not measurable the way it has been measured, if it is all measurable. Say you ask a subject how much he would pay to ensure a 1% probability of losing $100. You're trying to figure out how much he's overpaying for risk aversion or something even more foolish, loss aversion. But you cannot possibly ignore all the other financial risks he's taking. If he has a car parked outside that can be scratched, if he has a financial portfolio that can lose money, if he has a bakery that may risk a fine, if he has a child in college who may cost unexpectedly more, if he can be laid off, if he may be unexpectedly ill in the future, all these risks add up, and the attitude of the subject reflects them all. Ruin is indivisible and invariant to the source of randomness that may cause it." End of quote. So that's a very, I think, a very deep insight into how careful we have to be interpreting what seems to be a very clean experiment. Your willingness to pay for insurance, say, of a particular event.
Okay, let me simplify my methods. The way you approach a problem, say you take an economic theory, and you wonder if it changes if you make things dynamic, not static. You see, like in other words, it's not one-shot experiment, but many experiments, or many repetition of the same risk. And the second one is what I call you perturbate. In other words, you just assume that you may have the wrong model here and there. So these two tricks effectively cancel out much of the results of behavioral economics. Not the psychology. The psychological experiments are fine, but behavioral economics is trying to make something, derive rules from simplified sets. And let me also add another dimension that people miss. Say I ask an economist or a person who studied economics but not well enough, what's the worst case scenario? He or she would answer, well, my death. But I would say, well, do you have family? Can something be worse than just your death? And effectively say, oh, no, my death plus the death of my parents and children, and cousins and pets and so on. And so you continue. You tell them, how about the ruin of your tribe? You say, oh, yeah, no, that's worse definitely than that's a set that's worse than the previous one. And then till you hit the environment and Earth. And then what you notice is that they effectively, intuitively, when they don't, repeat what they've learned at school, they will consider a risk based on both repetition and life expectancy that is reduced by taking that risk. So, for example, if I cross the street, I'm not, I'm just reducing my life expectancy maybe by a second, or not even by nanosecond.
The expected value.
Exactly. The life expectancy, I'm reducing it. But if I am taking a risk for something higher than me, namely a tribe, the tribe is supposed to survive longer than me. And of course, humanity is supposed to have an extra few billion years. So you're reducing from that, the value of that. And of course, when you talk about ecosystem, would like to be permanent, or whatever you can call permanent, in billions of years. And you're reducing that by taking some actions. So the ranking of the risk based on the life expectancy that you're reducing is something that is not in the literature. So when we did our precautionary principle, and I had a talk with you about that, our point was that humanity should survive forever. So if you take these small repeated risks that threaten, humanity or threaten something we call terminal extinction or extinction risk, then you are gambling with something much more dangerous. And there is a pyramid of ruin risks. My ruin is not the big deal. I reduced my life expectancy. I think I've listened to your podcasts, extends my life, so maybe I'll live another 50 years. And 50 years is, I reduced my life expectancy by a little bit. It's not a big deal. But if I reduce the life expectancy of something that should survive an extra billion years, that's a big cost. And effectively, you can phrase that in terms of cost-benefit along these lines and obtain results that are vastly different from what is believed by the so-called risk community.
You criticize your critics of when you talk about the precautionary principle, they respond, but you do cross the street. So even though the expected loss is very small because the odds of being struck by a car are very small, yes, you do cross the street. You do take some risk of ruin. You don't just stay home in your bed. And what's your response to that?
My response is the way to treat these risks is how many times over my life will I cross the street? Several thousand times. Crossing the street reduces your life expectancy by 1 in 47,000 years. So it's not a big deal. The crossing the street basically is close to zero risk for me because my life expectancy is not infinite. But if you made humanity cross the street, that would be a problem because it would reduce its life expectancy commensurably. So the problem of these analyses that people throw around is that they ignore the value from life expectancy of whatever you are threatening.
So you give the
repetition. Yeah, but let me give you one simple example of how they miss a repetition.
Yeah.
The way they treat, and I say it in that chapter on rationality and on risk on rationality, survival is what matters first. Okay, so people have developed the instinct. Paranoia pays off. Basically, we've survived as a species, humans. However you define it, as whatever species we were, we have to have had some paranoia. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Been here after millions of years. So people develop good reasoning. So if you ask a psychologist, if you narrow the experiment the way they do it, and you say, why shouldn't I smoke a cigarette in a one-shot experiment? It makes a lot of sense. The risk is tiny and the pleasure is good. Okay, so I should smoke a cigarette. But your grandmother would say, I've never seen someone smoke a cigarette, enjoy it, and not smoke another one. So your grandmother would think in dynamic terms, because that's how we think. We think in dynamic terms. You see, paranoia locally, for example, if someone points out the risk of some terrorism or something, that apparently we are overestimating. But people don't understand that if you eliminate paranoia, you've eliminated eventually the human race. You have to have that paranoia for anything that entails a massive tail risk, and that's the only way to do it. So but I see it, in a reduced form in trading. You see traders, they basically are paranoid about anything that bankrupt them, but they don't care about variation. They bet, they speculate so long as they know they're not going to be, to put it this way, instinct. Yeah, you're wiped out. So that's the idea of separating these risks and risk of being wiped out. And what are you wiping out? Are you wiping out the community or wiping out something? And in the process, and talking to my co-author Sandus, who does philosophy of various philosophy of action, and he does ethics, and we solved a paradox that remained unsolved, and it's as follows. Aristotle, in his ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, has various statements that courage is the highest virtue, and at the same time prudence is the highest virtue. Now, and also there is a belief among the ancients that one, you should have all virtues or you have none. So in other words, if you have one virtue, you should have all the others, okay? And also there's another belief that one virtue equates to all the others. There's an equivalence. So whatever. So it looks like a paradox. How could you be both valuing courage, and risk-taking, and prudence, which is the avoidance of some classes of risk? Well, it turns out courage is prudence, okay, if you would equate, because if I save a collection of children from drowning, effectively I have reduced my life expectancy but increased theirs, which is longer and the more numerous children. So we understand that if you take risk for the collective, you are courageous, but also about yourself, but prudent for the collective. So that is how we solve that paradox, Constantine and I, and we're going to probably publish something if we get to it, but now verbally we're sort of like we're confident that we've solved that paradox. That wasn't seen that way, but if you start doing the things I was talking about, dynamic, in other words, things are repeated, and layering, in other words, things have a higher life expectancy than others, then you can solve a lot of paradoxes. And a lot of these things that appear to be biases in the literature and the the behavioral economics literature are not really, they're biases maybe, but they're not bad biases. They're necessary biases. You have to be necessarily careful about, paranoid about the survival, and particularly of something much higher than you.
So one example used in the book, which I think brings this home, is the smoking example that you just mentioned. I mean, it's just structured a slightly different way. 100 people smoking one cigarette a day might be relatively harmless. One person smoking 100 cigarettes a day is not so good. And you can't, as you point out often in the book, scaling is tricky. You can't just say, well, if 100 people smoking one cigarette is not so bad, then one person smoking 100 is the same thing, but they're not the same thing.
They're not the same. This is an anti-fragile that people are starting to get now, 5 years, 6 years later. And as I say, if 100 people jump 1 meter, is not the same risk as one person jumping 100 meters. So, I mean, because you have acceleration. So, and you have accumulation. And these things are, in fact, well understood by us psychologically. We are excellent risk managers when we're left on our own. And it's not some psychologist who just read a few books and knows baby mathematics who is going to make us look irrational and try to nudge us into some different behavior. The point is we have survived so much. We have a huge track record, and any statistician would say that something with such a track record has to have some evidence of skills in surviving.
I have to confess that when I worked in a racetrack in Monmouth, New Jersey for a summer, my grandmother did tell me not to place any bets. She was a wise woman. I, of course, was I thought I was a wiser 18-year-old. And since I had promised I wouldn't make any bets, I did keep that promise, sort of. I would occasionally, actually once a day, I would split a bet with the woman who worked in the kitchen. I was the Iceman. And it turned out we did okay. We didn't go on to that second bet, but I think that's what she was worried about, and correctly so. She was worried about me losing my summer money, my summer's earnings through addictive behavior. And I think it's a very interesting challenge to think about life as one-shot deals versus longer-term dynamics. One more cookie is always harmless, but when it's 10, because you've had 9 before, it's not so harmless. So it's hard to keep that in mind. It's a good thing to think about.
Thanks. Let me make a confession about gambling. I've been a trader for so many years, and I have such an allergy for gambling. I've never gambled. Every year I go to Las Vegas for a seminar or a conference where you drink, you eat, you do a lot of things. But the gambling table, I can't even concentrate on the table. I mean, I try to watch again. I can't concentrate. There's something about it that's so contrived that you really have to have a certain mindset to gamble that's not that of a trader. A trader doesn't like constrained rules. You see? And I know very few traders who gamble. Some of them play bridge, some play poker, which is slightly different, more dynamic. But gambling is not something that attracts traders. There's something, plus there's something horrifying about entering a trade knowing you're losing. You see?
Well, I think there's an opportunity here. Someone out there listening should fund or create the documentary Nassim Taleb at the Mirage. They would follow you through the casino. We would allow you to expound on the things you've been talking about in the first few minutes of this conversation. I think I see it as sort of a stop-action claymation kind of thing. I think it'd be awesome. I want to ask you a question about. First I want to let's talk about religion.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people, it's very fashionable. That's a disrespectful word. I'm going to rephrase that. A lot of smart people are very critical of religion these days. And one of the things that you hear is that religion is irrational. There's no evidence for it. It's a superstition that was comforting to people before we had the Enlightenment. And you argue in the book that religion, that's not the right way to think about the rationality of religion, and the fact that certain religions have survived for a long time shows that they're, quote, rational. And your definition of rationality in that context is the same as you've been using in this gambling context, which is it leads to survival. It promotes survival. So talk about religion.
What comment I would make is that it's not the religion that survives; it's people who have it who survive. So whatever beliefs these people have that allow them to survive, you cannot be discounted. By looking at their cosmetic expression. So let me. So religion. A few things we got to talk about. Let's make sure that we don't equate all religions, because some religions are religions, some other religions are not. Some are more literal, others are more, let's say it, semi-literal or definitely metaphorical. But one thing about belief, okay, and that's the core of rationality. If you and this came to me from meeting finally Ken Binmore, who really probably did more foundational work on rationality than anyone else. And Ken Binmore effectively says that all these attacks on economic decision making based on by arguing about irrationality misdefine rationality. You see, and for example, the conventional economics don't define you as the economic gains as accounting. It's just a book entry. There are other things, like if you, for example, give your money to the poor, there's nothing irrational about it. You see, there's some restrictions of coherence. So I thought of what he was saying and how people define rationality, and then went back to how people express what they call rational, and notice it is usually an ex ante, hence non-empirical definition of rationality. Ex ante means, I define an action as being rational. It means that you know everything that's going to go on around that action. In other words, that your model represents the world. And we've known since Simon bounded rationality that effectively you'll never be able to build a model that can understand the world. So when I say an action is irrational ex ante beforehand, I'd better have a track record of that action, because we need to see if because there are things that are not included in that model. So, for example, if I say that it is irrational to prefer A to B, B to C, but not C to A, I'd better have a good model that this holds in the real world. That's called the transitivity condition. And I have argued in Anti-Fragile that if you expand the model to saying that for an individual, it may make sense to be coherent, but collectively we cannot operate with coherent individuals because you deplete resources. For example, if you always prefer tuna to steaks, you would deplete the tuna supply, and so therefore you need to cycle, and nature makes you randomly change preferences, and that's a great way for things to survive. So, for example, these are the modification to the narrowly defined, what I call baby models that you encounter in behavioral economics or in decision making, and all these decisions, so-called decision sciences, what are called decision pseudosciences, is these reduce it and then find it irrational. Or, for example, if in intertemporal preferences, if someone offers you an apple today versus 2 apples tomorrow, in an ecological framework, you may say, well, what if the person is full of baloney? Okay, I'll take the apple now. Okay, I'm not taking it now because I prefer to eat an apple now. I'm taking it now because he may disappear. He may not come back, or he may die tomorrow. Okay, yeah. If you include these models, then a lot of these hyperbolic discounting models, all these models become much more coherent. So, but let me say something now about religion. Okay, so if I judge religion without its track record, I'm going to get into a lot of theoretical, I'm not just saying empirical, theoretical mistakes. Because if you think of what would have happened if if we didn't have these religions, I think that a lot of people would haven't had the right decisions. So religion allows you intergenerationally to convey some kind of behavior. Okay. Now, if you have to give the story with a religion to justify that behavior, well, that's it. I mean, who cares? So, and the example I used in the beginning is even in science, we don't have a perception. When I look at Greek columns, you see, there's a distortion for aesthetic reasons. Okay, religion may be a distorted a way for us to view the world that has allowed us to survive. So I give a lot of examples of how to judge religion. You should judge it ex post, not ex ante. And I take, for example, something that seems for non-religious Jews not rational, which is to have 500 and some dietary laws and 2 sinks in your kitchen. Now, when you think about it, well, it's the wrong way to just judge that on the basis of rationality. The way you got to see it is as follows: what if Jews didn't have these dietary laws? What would have happened? Well, you know that those who eat together band together, so they would be more dispersed, therefore much more vulnerable. And so they owe their survival to the dietary laws. So
if you take that view, and so a variant on that is that eating pork or shellfish is bad for your health in times when there's not good refrigeration and et cetera. If you take that anthropological perspective, there certainly isn't a case, rather than say a holy or divine one. There's no case for people to keep kosher today, if that's your view, right?
No, I really don't. We don't quite. We have to start from the basis that we don't fully understand the world, and rules that have survived a long time may have logic that we haven't detected yet. You see, the idea that people say, well, not eating shrimp is because they're impure, maybe because they're impure, or maybe because it's good to have dietary laws. Maybe it disciplines you elsewhere. I don't buy quite the idea of pork being insalubrious. Therefore, Semitic religions, except for Christianity, refuse pork. The idea, to me, is probably deeper, because the Greeks, also living in the same environment, the Cypriots and the Egyptians initially didn't have these dietary laws. The North Africans also didn't have these dietary laws, and came later. So I don't believe that you can. We should give a lot of reasons for these. They should go back and say, "Oh, they've detected the insalubrious thing," as necessarily the reason. It's a possible one, but you can never test it. What we know is that these religions have helped in survival, and whatever is related to survival is essential, because there's a past dependence. To do science, you must first survive.
So I want to. Do you want to say anything else about religion? I'm not.
Yes,
because I have a few other. I want to switch gears in a minute. But do you want to add anything else? I mean,
Yes,
listeners know that I keep Jewish law. There's certainly parts of Jewish law that are not easy to accept or to view as rational. But as you say, I take the whole picture. I don't choose one by one, and the outcome for me has been very good. It doesn't mean I don't mean the sense very good that I'm rich or I'm healthy or whatever. I find the practice of my religion deeply satisfying, and I'm Talebian enough to say I can't then take one plank out of the boat and say, well, this one doesn't make sense. I accept the whole thing with all of its flaws, and the outcome ex post is good for me.
You will notice one thing, that religions come as a package, and you cannot pick and select. Otherwise, it's not like political parties. You can be on the left with respect to abortion, but on the right with respect to economic. It doesn't come that way. Religion comes as a simple block. You take it all or leave it all.
Yeah, you're either in the club or you're not. Now, there are different clubs with different rules, so you can choose to that extent, but.
But even then, But one thing that's misunderstood is I started looking. I've been for a long time, for about 20 some years, looking at religion, mostly because I'm interested in Semitic languages and Semitic beliefs, not so much initially in theology. And I've noticed that people call religion, they're very confused about what they call religion. And the following will try to explain to us the main difference between atheism and secularism. Why we should, focus on secularism, not atheism. So when religion you notice for the Jews was initially law, so it was a legal system. So, but it was tribal initially, and then later on, of course, expanded. For the Arabs, for the Muslims, religion was law. And actually, the word deen in Arabic is a law. If you use Aramaic, you use nomus for law, not deen, religion. But deen in Arabic means law, and Medina is a place where law prevails. And actually, the name of the state of Israel is Medinat, and in Arabic city is Medina. So so you realize that deen means law. Bet Din is a courthouse, and you're taking law. That's basically it. It's a unified body of law that you prescribe to. That's religion. That was religion. Now came Christianity. Christianity is fundamentally a secular religion, because from the Christ himself, didn't really want to have right against Romans. It was, he said, give Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So it was not like let's take over and Caesar. So the idea, of course, Christianity, of course, evolved here and there into theocracies. But it could not fundamentally accommodate the notion of being a law. Why? Well, very simply, it developed, and it was absorbed by the Roman Empire. It developed within a system in which law was a Roman law. And I know the subject quite well, as I was interested in the School of Law of Beirut, which was effectively where law was made. And then you can see how the documents, there were some pagan scholars, when Theodosius made his code, the main code for the Roman Empire. And later on, the Theodosius code, all they took is pagan Roman law and added a blessing, a couple of pages of blessing in the beginning. So it was not Sharia. And you notice that so Christianity was separation between church and state from the beginning. And that separation is what allowed the modern world to develop. And the secular approach. And the second thing I mentioned in the book is that when you look at the behavior of the people, you should not look at what people say, but how they behave. You notice that, and as that chapter is called, is a Pope Atheist. If you look at the behavior of anyone, anyone within these branches of Christianity, of course you got to exclude the fringe ones like Scientology and all of that. You will notice that when facing big decision, they act the same way as an atheist. Someone like, for example, the Pope and Richard Dawkins would go to the same hospital to get the same treatment. The difference is they would wrap it up differently. And then you notice also how people, atheists, go to a concert where they're silent and meditative, and Christians, go to mass where they are also doing the same thing, and effectively sometimes listening to the same music. So the idea is you get, when it's skin in the game, the entire concept of skin in the game is look at what people do, not what people say. So that's what I have to say about religion.
But I didn't understand that parallel precisely. At least I didn't understand what your takeaway. I understand my takeaway. My takeaway comes from David Foster Wallace, who says everyone worships. We all have an urge to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and some people express that through their religion. Some people express it through a concert. Some people express it through a sports team. Some people express it through a political party, a political movement.
Yeah, but
that sense of belonging. That tribal sense of belonging is a very powerful part of who we are. So when I think about your point about, I'm going to expand on what you said in the book rather than what you said just now. When the Pope goes to the hospital, there's a lot of well-wishers and prayers and believers who hope to get some kind of divine response, but he also goes to the hospital. He doesn't just rely on the prayer. And similarly, when Richard Dawkins goes to the hospital, he also goes to the hospital first. He also has well-wishers. They don't think they're bringing divine intervention, but they're hoping that he turns out all right. And there's some sort of a community response among people who like his work, just like there are people who like the Pope. What's the point of those parallels, and what's that have to do with skin in the game?
Okay, it has to do with the following. The whole idea of skin in the game, as outlined in the prologue, is I don't really care what people think. I care about what they do. See, it's about action, not what comes behind as ornament, thought as ornament. I consider thought as just pure background furniture, and that may lead you to a certain action, and that's skin in the game. Skin in the game is to establish a difference, and the problems, a lot of the pathologies that we have in the modern world come from the fact that we forget that almost everything that was developed and it came from skin in the game, not from thinking. And sometimes you can find thinking as justification. Like we didn't develop the steam engine by looking at the previous work, where the Greeks had one model of it came from developing it with our hands. So in other words, that we live in a world that is very easy to capture by doing, but not easy to capture by thinking. And thinking to me is, I put it in its proper context. Now,
are you saying that the Pope talks like a religious person, but he acts like an atheist because he doesn't just rely on prayer? He actually goes to a doctor.
Exactly. I watch people doing things, how they would act in circumstances, and I noticed that the difference between a secular Christian and a secular Christian, in other words, someone who is a Catholic or an Orthodox person, and an atheist would be the same, facing some action. So therefore, I don't see the point of atheism, because of that.
I don't see that. Explain.
Okay. In other words, let's not focus on what people think, focus on what they do. And if you judge people, and Martian observes the behavior of atheists and secular Christians, he would observe the same behavior when it comes to things that matter.
And so you're saying that, are you suggesting that the Pope is a hypocrite for going to the hospital?
Not at all. That we have... and
are the atheists hypocrites for going to the concert because they're also religious?
The idea of atheism assumes that religion is literal, and the religion is about the criticism of religion by atheists, and the promotion of atheism assumes that the behavior of it's the thought that matters, not the behavior. And the behavior of Christians is pretty much the one that atheists would like people to have.
Okay.
You see, that was my point. But there's another thing about religion that I'm going to say here, is that religion historically was about skin in the game. So the gods did not like cheap talk. So they liked, they like you to, do something. So you had to offer sacrifices, and it was a great model in the past because it forced you into sacrifices. And there's something that stayed with us that talks cheap from that and in behavior. Another thing I'm going to say of religion is I thought for a long time why the Christian religion insisted on the Christ being both man and God. And the fact is, he had skin in the game by being man, and people respect those with skin in the game. Had he been God, he wouldn't have suffered. And I noticed that a lot of people who have scars effectively are, exhibiting their skin in the game. They're not empty bureaucrats or something like what I call an empty suit in the book. And you would have been an empty suit if you're not harmed by anything. And I observed how Trump owes most of his appeal, or owed during the Republican primary when he was standing next to people, and he looked real because he lost money, because his adversaries were saying, oh, he lost so much money. It made him real. It's much better than someone who lives in cyberspace just writing memos, you see. And the American public understood that, something that the intellectual didn't get, that America is not about talking; it's about doing. And losing money is a evidence that you are in a doing business, not in a talking business.
Yeah, well, the claim is in Silicon Valley that, I don't know if it's still true, but it used to be the claim that if you'd gone bankrupt, if you'd had a startup that failed, or even better, a couple, then maybe it was easier to raise money because then you'd at least shown that you'd had those scars.
Exactly.
You were carrying those around with you. You learned something, and then in theory now you could go off and be successful. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow, but that's, warriors try to show off their scars, and these scars, visibly are sign of. People don't interpret these as sign of incompetence. Oh, look, he has scar. He's not good. He's not a good warrior like the other person who escaped. No, scars means that you're in business, and that makes people. That creates an appeal. So the suffering of the Christ are part of that. So I have these things on theology that are sort of counterintuitive, and but that allowed me to engage in a few discussions with people into these things, into theology. I like the line you have in the book from the Spartan mother, the mother in Sparta, who says to her son, "Come back with your shield or on it." I think that's an incredibly powerful way to think about skin in the game, right? You said if you run away, you can run faster without your shield. Your mom doesn't want you at home without your shield.
Exactly. Yeah, but societies put a huge premium on individual courage, particularly when it came courage not to gamble in a casino or throw yourself off a cliff, but courage in order to help others in battle and protecting something larger than you.
So, I want to talk about the modern challenge that skin in the game faces that I don't think we've talked about before, which came up to me as I was reading the book now for the second time. You give the example of Hammurabi's code, where a builder, if the house collapses that the builder built, the builder is put to death, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. In other words, it prevents the builder from having hidden risks in foundations.
Right, because the builder knows more than the buyer. There's this asymmetry of knowledge. And so to prevent the builder from taking advantage of that, cutting corners and making a flawed building, if I remember correctly, maybe I'm wrong, but the building collapsing, killing somebody.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's a symmetry. If it kills the firstborn son of the owner, the firstborn son of the architect is put to death. So
in our modern world, I would argue, we've moved increasingly away from skin in the game. The welfare state is an example of it.
Yeah,
the corporate bailouts that we have are examples of it. We don't like – a lot of us are uncomfortable with this idea of skin in the game. And given how appealing it is to you and somewhat to me, I'm thinking, well, so why is that? And one answer is, of course, that it's not – buildings don't just collapse because you cut corners. They collapse because bad luck, a hurricane, a lot of things happen outside the control of the architect or the builder. The idea of executing him for something that isn't his fault doesn't sit so well with us. So we love do-overs. We love giving people a second chance. We love extra credit homework to bring your grade up and all these things. And, of course, this encourages people to act imprudently. It has all kinds of costs, but the other side is also somewhat unpleasant to people.
But I mean the medicine and I in I think the second chapter, first or second chapter, I discuss the case of medicine. If you were going to if the doctor amputates the wrong leg, you have to amputate one of the doctor's legs. No, because we start looking at things statistically, and we have looked at medical performance by doctors or a risk caused by doctors statistically. I mean, you can do it once, that's fine. If you do it twice, maybe a third time where you're going to be in trouble, you see. So the idea of the architect killing one person definitely needs to be penalized. But let's go back to a central idea that you have detected, very few economists have detected. And again, in the history of literature, the literature of economics, we can only find 2 or 3 papers on the subject, and it is as follows. Most of economics is perceived to be incentives and disincentives. So skin in the game would be to incentivize people if they do well and also disincentivize them. But that's not it, no. Skin in the game for me is about filtering. It's evolution. You cannot have evolution if you don't have skin in the game. In other words, you're filtering people out of the system. And I give the example of bad drivers. Now, why is it that on a highway, when I drive on a highway, I rarely encounter people who are, go tapioca and then crazily kill 30 people? Why doesn't it happen? Well, it doesn't happen because bad drivers kill themselves, partly because they kill themselves, and also partly because, we catch them, we filter them out of the system by taking away their driver's license, and we're good at doing that for those who have survived. So this is filtering. Filtering is necessary for the functioning of nature, necessary for the functioning of anything, and that's called evolution. Now, restaurants, if you allow bad restaurants to survive, soon you'd be eating the cafeteria food and immortal cafeterias, because basically university cafeterias are immortal. I see them like state, institutions. So whereas you have the pressure, and in New York we have great food. I get my squid ink in places because they're mortal. Okay, so that's filtering. Now, that point of skin in the game, you pointed out a paper to me, and I found another couple. In economics is about that if you put evolutionary filters, you get the same behavior as if people were rational. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I want to back up a little bit, because when we did this interview last August on this this topic came up, and you said skin in the game is a disincentive. And I said, yeah, it's not just you get rewarded if you do well, but you get punished if you do badly. And I totally misunderstood your point. Your point is that you don't have to be, quote, rational as an individual. The normal idea of skin in the game, so let me try to restate it the way I think of it as an economist. The normal idea of skin in the game is what economists call incentives. So if I know I can get rich, I'm going to try really hard. If I know I can lose all my money, I'm going to be cautious. And your point is that even if you're not aware of those incentives, even if you ignore those incentives, people who are wise and make good investments are going to be around because they don't hit that absorbing barrier. And people who make bad investments are going to be wiped out and be taken out of the pool. And that is a very different level of rationality. You might call it meta-rationality or systemic.
Exactly. Collective
rationality, systemic rationality.
Yeah. One comment here, one footnote on rationality for continue that we didn't say before, is that the other problem that I have in my chapter on minority rule or collective behavior versus individual behavior is that you can easily have what you define as irrational people. Okay.
Rational or irrational?
Irrational people. You can define irrationality the way you want, and the collective may behave in how you may define as rational. So collective behavior doesn't flow from a naive, arithmetic sum of individual behavior, because of fundamental asymmetries built into it. So
that's Vernon Smith's point, right? Vernon Smith, who got
of course. Vernon Smith, yes, go ahead.
Who got the Nobel Prize at the same time as Kahneman. Kahneman was saying people do all these irrational things, and Vernon Smith's point was, sure they do, but the market encourages as partly through this filter of what we might call profit and loss or survival and thriving, the market is going to be rational because it's going to punish people even if they're not paying attention. If they're not paying attention, they're going to be punished. It doesn't matter that they have to notice. If eventually,
well, actually, yeah, I have another argument, which is I brought in the book, that the market is not driven by the arithmetic sum of participants, but the most motivated buyers has a minority rule, which we discussed last time. And if you look at it based on minority rule, then you realize that you can't really study the behavior of individuals and get any inference about the behavior of the market. So that's one thing about rationality. And I've seen even beyond the market, when you say about humanity, humans if the humans collectively, each one makes a mistake of, say, for example, having intransitive preferences. You prefer apple to oranges, oranges to pears, but pears to apple, whether sequentially or stuff like that, collectively, it doesn't mean that the whole world will have this thing wash out so beautifully in aggregation. But that's quite central beyond markets, because when we look at societies versus individual, when we look at selfish gene versus other forms of more collective form of preference, behavior. So you have, and mathematically, you can see that very clearly if you do the mathematics, and that's what I regret. The problem with all these nudging consequences taken by economists make no sense when you look at collective versus individual.
And the paper I sent you that you referenced is a paper Gary Becker wrote a long time ago, I think in 1962. I can't remember the year.
Yeah.
But and Gary's gone, alas. But he wrote a paper that I thought was kind of a silly paper as a graduate student. Not that I could think anything of Gary Becker's as silly, but I never understood it, which was that even if people don't even if people aren't utility maximizers, when prices change, when prices go up, they're more likely to buy less of something simply because the domain which they can choose from has gotten smaller. And the example he gives is that let's just assume people choose randomly. There's no rationality. They're not maximizing anything. They just choose randomly. And he shows that if people just choose randomly, they're more likely to choose less of something when its price goes up and more of something when its price goes down. And he used that as a justification for demand curves. Despite the fact that you might not find utility maximization very palatable. And that's part of what you're saying. You're saying that individuals could be erratic, but the system is going to purge people who make bad decisions and enhance the survival of people who make happen perhaps by random choice decisions.
Shyam Sundar did something on zero intelligence agents, and when he called it was like a big revelation at the time. A wonderful idea is as follows: you can have zero intelligence players and a very intelligent market.
Yeah, it's crazy. Let's talk for a minute about inequality. You make the point in the book, which reminds me a little bit of the points we talked earlier about probability over time versus at a point in time. You argue in the book that the way people are looking at inequality is wrong, that they should look at lifetime incomes. And if they do that, they'll see that people move in and out of different classes of income over the course of their lifetime, and that therefore there's no such thing as the rich or the middle class. Is that an accurate way to describe what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. The problem of the measures of inequality we have are effectively ensemble inequality. In other words, you take the all Americans and look at how much the winner controls and so on. And so you say the top 1% has 50% of the wealth and things like that. Let's have a revolution and let's tax them. But what people don't get is, and I'm sure statistics, that 10% of Americans will spend 1 year in the top 1%, something like that. About half of Americans will spend 1 year in the top 10%. And the way to analyze inequality is exactly like the same as the dynamic probability of ruin. You got to look at it over time. Over your lifetime, of course, you're going to spend years not making money. You're going to be at the bottom, and you're going to spend years spend some time making a lot of money. So the way you look at the health of a country isn't in so much in the opportunity to rise, okay, or the opportunity to be, or the number of people who are middle class, is in the probability of losing your status of top dog. You see, and nobody, very few people look at it that way. For example, take the Forbes 500 of 1985 versus 2015. You'd be shocked. 30 years later, a very small proportion, like something like 10% of families were in both. You see, so we have you have an engine in America to destroy the very strong. Although it creates inequality, it does also create opportunity. And opportunity is not. If someone rises, someone at the top has to fall, and it's easy to fall in America. Take France, and you get shockingly depressing results. That effectively, some people stay in the same class all their lives. The upper middle class of civil servants, or friends of the state, civil servants, or heads of companies related to states. Once you did you study at certain universities, you're done for life. You have that effect in America, but those who rise are usually those who come from out of nowhere. And if you take Florence, and you'll notice that places, the wealth in medieval times was in the same families as the wealth is found today. Okay, largely. So people discuss mobility naively, and I just proposed a measure of inequality based on transition probabilities. It's a completely different approach, and it will give you a much rosier image of America. Now, another interesting thing that comes with America, the health of companies, the same applies to corporations. In America today, the corporations tend to stay 12 years on average in the S&P 500. And that's very good news. It is very good news, okay? Look in Europe what happens when companies becoming cozy with the state manage to stick around, see? So it's the same thing. We got to look at the same thing from a standpoint of inequality. And plus, there are other metrics in inequality, very technical, and measurements of Gini's and stuff that are not right. In other words, people give you the illusion that these have been growing over time when it may be just the wrong computation.
Yeah, well, I like to point out that if you go back to, say, 1985, some of the people in the top 1% weren't even born today. In the top 1% today weren't even born, certainly in 1970 or 1975. But having said that,
but they're talking about families also.
Right, and their families were not wealthy. Yeah,
60% is dominated by families.
So I'm sympathetic to your point. As listeners will know, I think it's very important to remember that people can move in and out of different levels of income. But I do think, being financially well off myself, I think my children have a lot of advantages that other children don't have. And it's not just genetic. Some of it's genetic. My kids have pretty good genes, I think. But they also have certain opportunities, connections I've made, things I've been able to teach them that are going to make it more likely that they do not fall into the, say, bottom half of the income distribution. And people in the bottom half are going to struggle to get into the top half because they don't have some of the advantages that my children have. And people have gone so far with this to say it's immoral. I'm going to just go to an extreme here. It's immoral to read to your kids before they go to bed. Because it gives them a leg up on the competition. That repulses me. That repulses me. But I do accept the point that there is some. It's a much smaller chance for my children to get into to fall into subsistence poverty, say, than somebody in the bottom half of the income distribution. They start far from it, and they have certain advantages that keep them from it. So I think there are some issues there. I do think the most important thing to keep in mind is I think that people want to get ahead. They don't necessarily want to get ahead of others. And I think we should always discourage the natural human urge to get ahead of others rather than just ahead. But there are some challenges, I think, in the American system today that make it harder for people to be upwardly mobile that I think are bad.
You will encounter a problem that I didn't put in a book, but but I may in the future, or may in some other book or writing, which is that what you consider is a unit. So the remedy for that is if I cannot transmit my wealth to my children, what's my motivation? Why do I have to work? Well, I'm working to give them a better future. So the efforts now what is a unit? If you consider, and that's modernity, that an individual is a unit, then of course it's unfair because my children are going to get more money than others. But if I consider that the unit is my family and my bloodline and everything, as I do, all right, and therefore, depriving me of the possibility of transmitting my wealth to, because your children are part of you. You see, if they're hurt, it's worse than if you're hurt. You see, how can't you give them your money? So you got to think along these lines, and I've been doing a lot of thinking. I didn't put it fully in a book about what is the definition of a unit. Is a unit you? Is a unit your tribe? Is a unit you and your descendant? Is a unit you and your fellows? Is a unit you and members of the Stanford club, for insightful economic discussions? What is your unit? And your inability to transmit some of what you have for your unit because you feel that's you, all right, is a limitation that no government should be allowed to make without without further investigation or more deeper thinking about the problem. Well,
the other point I want to make is that we shouldn't just care about how much stuff we have. Obviously, stuff's important, but what we really care about, I think, is flourishing and using our skills.
Yeah, plus another thing I've noticed, all these discussions about inequality don't come from people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. They come from people, professors of economics, not you, of course, but left-wing professors of economics, who feel they're making a lot of money, but they're envious of the richer. And I've cited a lot of papers from going all the way from the ancients to the modern or less modern, like Gruyere, that people are jealous of people around them, so they're envious. So if you ask someone at the bottom, what would you like? They'd like a better fridge, a new car, and that's it. But if you ask someone, professor at Harvard, what is something sociology at Harvard, what they would like their neighbor to be poorer. So, you see, so this is because it is sort of the gold medal. The gold medal, exactly. It's the silver medal who hates the gold medal. You see, when
uncharitable view of some of my fellow academics, although they're not in the Stanford Club for Insightful Economic Discussions. That's a club I'm definitely going to start. We're going to have T-shirts. I love that. SCIED. Before we finish, I just want to add one challenge to you, Nassim, which is not. Just came to me, which is, we're talking about the filtering power of skin in the game, and yet we do want that restaurateur to come back and make the second restaurant better. We do want Bill Belichick to, after his failure at Cleveland, not to be wiped out. We want him to come back and try again. And that entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who has the 3 failures, we don't say, "Oh, you're out of the club." So it is a little more complicated.
It is, and it's not. In other words, the fact is, and the beauty of the idea of skin in the game, is that you should have the same. Like when you drive, you have the same risk as you inflict on others. And that was the symmetry of the architect in Hammurabi's code, is that what you inflict on others, you also inflict it to yourself.
You should eat your own cooking, which is exactly. Why you put it.
Exactly. So for tail risks, this works effectively, and for medium risk, of course, you survive, but everybody survives. So you're not inflicting any big danger on others. You see, in the previous discussion on skin in the game, I spoke about people being morally calibrated. Most people, butchers, everybody's morally calibrated, you see. this removing the tail risk, preventing people from coming back if they inflict a lot of risk on others. Like, for example, warriors. Every warrior, traditionally, society has, we are where we are today because warriors are in battle. You see, so if you're a complete uncontrollable warmongers, like many people in Washington today, or some journalists and many think tank people, you would end up dying in battle. And these people don't die in battle. So that's what I meant. The restaurant owner, of course, is going to be filtered, or the theme is going to be filtered. Okay, he won't have a bad restaurant; it's something else. But he's not inflicting undue risk on others. He's only inflicting risks on his investors and on himself, and eventually, if he's very bad, he'll run out of money.
Which is sufficient punishment. He's not executed, unless he kills people through food poisoning.
Exactly. If he eats his food, he'll be out of, exactly.
Well, let's close with the following. We can't remember. I didn't check what year we did our first interview, but it was some while back. 2007, and it was about The Black Swan, which is a book I liked. And as I said the last time we talked, I actually like Fooled by Randomness better. It's Fooled by Randomness remains one of my all-time favorite books. So you wrote that book a long time ago. I think you said almost 20 years ago. And a set of other books just sort of emerged without planning. The Black Swan came next, and then you had, I think you had The Bed of Procrustes, a set of aphorisms from your Twitter experience. Then you had Anti-Fragile, and now you've got Skin in the Game, and you call this entire project Inserto. I want to pronounce it correctly. And I don't know what Inserto means, by the way. What does Inserto mean?
Uncertainty in Latin.
Okay. So you have explored through a set of books and papers and now, for me, our conversations, a topic that is inherently unknowable, which is uncertainty, but one can get better understandings of it as you think about it more and more. And my question is, are you done? Is this the last book of Inserto? Is there another book in the works? Are you going to count your royalties, which are quite nice?
It is uncertain. The subtitle for the Inserto is an investigation of luck, uncertainty, probability, opacity, human error, risk, disorder, and especially decision-making in a world we don't understand. Okay, so it's about if it's about things we don't understand and how to make decisions, well, visibly the set is going to expand over time, and I may write another book. I think I have an idea what I'm going to be writing next, but I'd like to take a break. Writing doesn't bother me. What really bothers me is the book tours. When you become a marketer rather than being a producer, and I'm not, there's something about marketing that makes me feel like I'm doing something, I'm betraying my work because you're spending time away from your real work. So I don't like book tours, or not too much, but I like a conversation with you because, as I told you, every time I have a conversation on EconTalk, and also Skin in the Game, I've learned from EconTalk. There's asymmetry I need to get back. So so this is what really scares me about writing a book is the packaging of it, not so much the composition. But I've been writing papers in the meanwhile, and papers are book tour free. There's no paper tour. Well, actually, academics have paper tours, but I don't have to do it. I just post it, and that's it.
So I have a great idea for you. I think for your next book, if there is one, you tell your publisher, I'm not going to do any touring. All I'm going to do, the only promotion, will be to make my 9th appearance on EconTalk.
Well, that's what I told them. Believe it or not, that's what I told them for this book.
And then, that way, your publisher has an enormous incentive to help promote EconTalk because your publisher will have skin in the game with me, which I think is just phenomenal.
You don't know publisher. This is what I told them. It's actually almost what I told them. I told them I'm going to do a few appearances with friends and that's it. No book tour. And guess what? We put the book on embargo. Now it's embargoed. But then they came up with a list of things they want me to, they want to send me here, there, talk to this journalist. No, so I'm not really, I told them no book tour, and they still gave me a book tour.
Yeah, it's just a diminutive one, though. It's a short book tour.
Hopefully.
Keep up the good work. My guest today has been Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Nassim, as always, it's a pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.